What if you were told that the greatest obstacle to learning has never been a lack of intelligence, but a misunderstanding of what understanding actually is? People often believe that education is a matter of storing information, memorizing definitions, repeating formulas, reciting procedures. Yet anyone who has ever stared at a page full of facts and felt them slip away knows that memory built on repetition alone fades like chalk in the rain. There is a deeper way to learn, a way that has been available to people long before the invention of any modern device, a way rooted in the nature of how the human mind makes sense of the world. And once you see it, the whole idea of memorizing without meaning becomes as unnecessary as trying to hold water in your hands. Think about how many times people have sat with a thick textbook, scanning the same paragraph again and again, hoping that if the eyes sweep over the words enough times, the mind will somehow absorb them. Picture a student copying notes from a blackboard, filling page after page, believing that the more ink poured onto paper, the more knowledge settles in the mind. Yet hours later, when that same student tries to explain the idea in plain language, it collapses. This is a universal experience, the illusion of learning created by passive exposure. The brain grows familiar with shapes of words, echoes of phrases, appearances of formulas, and mistakes that familiarity for understanding. People across all generations have fallen for this trap. The problem is simple. Too many learners try to remember without first making sense of what they are remembering. They collect facts the way someone might collect stones, carrying them around but not knowing what to build. And when the test comes, or when a real situation demands genuine reasoning, the stones scatter and nothing remains. Human memory was never built to store isolated fragments easily. It was built to store structure, connections, stories, principles. The mind remembers what it understands because understanding is the natural shape of knowledge, not a pile of disconnected pieces. So what is the alternative? How do people move from memorizing words to grasping the ideas beneath them? The method has been known in classrooms, in libraries, in quiet corners, where thinkers have worked through problems using nothing more than paper, pencil, and honest curiosity. It rests on a few timeless principles that have guided learners for centuries. The first principle is this: if you cannot explain something in simple language, then you do not understand it. This does not mean simplifying it so much that it loses meaning, but rather stripping away decorative vocabulary and getting down to the core of the idea. Imagine taking a complicated concept and trying to describe it to someone who has never seen it before. Not by reciting the textbook sentence, but by revealing why it works, how it works, and what problem it solves. When people try this, they immediately discover the holes in their knowledge. Those holes are not failures, they are guides. They point to the exact places where thinking must deepen. The second principle is that understanding grows by working with ideas, not just reading about them. Consider a student learning mathematics. Reading a solution from a textbook can give the impression that the reasoning is obvious, even easy. But when that same student takes a blank sheet of paper, closes the book, and tries to reproduce the reasoning step by step, the illusion fades. Suddenly, each transition demands justification. Every symbol requires meaning. The mind must construct the idea, not just observe it. It has long been known that active thinking burns the path into memory, while passive exposure merely brushes the surface. Third, people understand things better when they connect new ideas to old ones. Human memory is not a collection of drawers, but a network. New knowledge attaches itself to what is already known. Think of reading a difficult chapter in a science book. If the reader pauses after each section and asks, "How does this relate to what I already know? Does it confirm something? Does it contradict something? Does it expand something?" Then, the new idea finds a place in the existing structure. Without these connections, the idea floats alone, easy to forget because it has no anchor. A fourth timeless principle is that confusion is not a sign of weakness. It is a necessary companion of learning. People often assume that understanding should feel smooth, but the moments that feel awkward, the points where the mind strains, are exactly the points where deeper comprehension forms. Imagine working through a physics problem on paper and reaching a part that makes no sense. The immediate impulse might be to skip ahead to the solution. But if one instead stays with the confusion, breaks the problem into smaller pieces, rewrites it in their own words, draws a diagram on a blank page, or even temporarily steps aside to examine a simpler case, something begins to shift. The confusion turns into clarity. That transformation is understanding, taking shape. The fifth principle is inquiry. Not the kind of inquiry that waits for someone else to provide the answer, but the internal inquiry, where a person questions every step until the idea becomes transparent. Why is this formula shaped this way? What assumption lies behind this statement? Under what conditions would this idea fail? These questions are not signs of disrespect toward the material. They are signs of engagement. People who ask such questions force their minds to wrestle with ideas until those ideas become part of their thinking. Now, consider what lies beneath these principles. To understand is not to remember a string of words. It is to reconstruct an idea from its foundation. The brain naturally organizes information into structures, causes, effects, patterns, comparisons, models. When someone truly understands a concept, they can rebuild it from a small starting point. And because they can rebuild it, they no longer need to memorize it. The idea becomes something they can regenerate whenever needed, like a pattern that emerges naturally when the right conditions are present. This mechanism has always been present. Long before people wrote textbooks, long before blackboards hung in classrooms, long before scholars filled notebooks with equations and diagrams, humans learned by understanding patterns in the world. A farmer understanding the rhythm of seasons, a craftsman understanding the properties of materials, a navigator understanding the motion of stars. All of them relied on comprehension, not memorization. The principles of learning are older than any subject we study. When people read passively, the mind stays in a low state of engagement. It receives shapes, hears rhythms of sentences, recognizes familiar symbols, but does not test them. When the mind does not test, it does not build structure, and without structure, memory remains fragile. But when the mind digs for meaning, when it tries to explain, connect, question, and reconstruct, it becomes active. It shifts from absorbing to generating, and this shift transforms learning. Think about what really happens when someone tries to explain an idea on paper. They start writing a sentence, then pause, realizing that the next step is not as clear as it first seemed. They return to the beginning and attempt again, this time using a simpler description. Suddenly, a connection appears. This part relates to a principle learned earlier. They note the connection, and the explanation becomes clearer. This simple act of writing is a mirror for thought. It reveals not what the mind believes it knows, but what it actually knows. Now imagine applying these principles to everyday learning, using nothing more than books, paper, and the willingness to think. Picture someone reading a challenging chapter in a textbook. Instead of trying to memorize each statement, they pause after every significant idea and attempt to restate it in their own words on a blank sheet. They don't aim for elegance, they aim for clarity. If the idea resists explanation, the reader returns to the text, then back to the paper, tightening the circle of understanding. Slowly, the material becomes transparent. Or imagine a classroom where a teacher introduces a new concept. Instead of copying every word the teacher writes, students listen and then try to express the idea in the simplest language possible. They compare explanations with one another, noticing where one understanding differs from another. This process reveals the edges of confusion and points the way toward deeper clarity. Consider someone studying a scientific principle. Instead of memorizing the formula, they ask, "Where does this come from? What are its limits? Can I derive it on paper using basic ideas I already know?" Even if the derivation is imperfect, the attempt creates meaning, and once meaning is created, memorization is no longer needed. Think of learning a difficult proof in mathematics. One could try to memorize every step, hoping that remembering them in sequence will be enough. But a far better approach is to ask, why does the argument need this step? What is the core insight that makes the proof work? When that insight is clear, the steps fall naturally into place. These applications are not tricks. They are reflections of how the mind operates. People remember stories better than lists, principles better than isolated facts, patterns better than fragments. Understanding is the shape of knowledge that fits the mind most comfortably. Now, consider the deeper philosophical truth behind this. Understanding is not something that people receive, it is something they create. A teacher can point the way, a book can offer guidance, a blackboard can display symbols, but the actual work of forming clarity happens inside the learner's own thinking. People have always had to build knowledge themselves. No one can hand understanding to someone else like passing an object across a table. It must be constructed through active engagement. This means that learning is not a performance for others. It is not about reciting answers. It is not about impressing teachers or peers. It is an internal process, a conversation between the mind and the idea. And when the conversation becomes honest, when someone admits confusion, confronts misunderstanding, pushes for simplification, real learning begins. There is also a humbling truth. Understanding requires effort, but the effort is joyful once the process is embraced. People often avoid challenging ideas because the first encounter feels difficult. But difficulty is not a sign of inability. It is the natural friction of thought. When someone continues through that friction, the idea begins to open, revealing patterns and connections that were invisible at first. This experience is one of the most satisfying moments in learning, the moment when confusion transforms into clarity. Now imagine using these ideas to study any subject. Suppose someone reads a chapter on electricity. Instead of memorizing terms like voltage, current, and resistance, they try to picture physical analogies, perhaps water flowing through pipes or charges moving through wires. They explain these analogies on paper, refine them, find the limits of the comparison, and then revisit the formal definitions. The technical terms now float inside a structure instead of hovering alone. The memory becomes effortless. Or consider someone learning a new language. Instead of memorizing vocabulary lists, they use the words in simple sentences, connect them to familiar ideas, and construct meaning. The words become part of thought, not pieces of information to recall under pressure. Picture a student studying history. Rather than memorizing dates, they ask why certain events unfolded the way they did. What patterns connect different periods? What forces guided decisions? The narrative becomes clear, and the dates become natural reference points rather than burdens. These are examples of understanding, replacing memorization, not by eliminating memory, but by making it unnecessary to force. Memory becomes a natural consequence of comprehension. People sometimes believe that understanding is only for those with talent, while memorization is for everyone else. But this belief collapses when examined closely. Every child understands complex ideas about the world long before learning formal words. Understanding is not rare. It is the default way human beings learn. It is only later, often in formal schooling, that people fall into the habit of memorizing without meaning. When people return to the natural method, asking questions, explaining ideas, simplifying, and making connections, they rediscover the ease of learning. Not ease in the sense of no effort, but ease in the sense that effort leads somewhere, that thinking builds something lasting instead of dissolving in a matter of hours. Consider now what this means for anyone seeking mastery in any field. The key is not to gather more facts, but to illuminate the relationships between them. It is not to read faster, but to think slower. It is not to conquer more material, but to see the structure inside a small piece of it. Once the structure is clear, adding new ideas becomes simple. The mind knows where to place them. This shift in mindset transforms learning from a burden into a craft. Instead of cramming information into memory, people begin shaping it, reorganizing it, testing it. They become active participants in their own intellectual growth. And eventually, something remarkable happens. The boundaries between subjects begin to blur. A principle learned in one field suddenly illuminates a problem in another. A mathematical pattern resembles a musical rhythm. A principle of physics mirrors a concept from philosophy. This is the sign of genuine understanding, when knowledge becomes flexible, transferable, and alive. As you consider these ideas, think about how they apply to your own learning. Imagine taking a subject that once felt confusing and approaching it with this method. Instead of trying to memorize, you begin by asking, What is the fundamental idea here? How would I explain it simply? You write your explanation, find gaps, return to the material, refine your understanding, ask new questions, and gradually build a clear picture. This approach may take time, but it takes far less time than forgetting and relearning endlessly. In a world filled with distractions and shortcuts, the timeless approach remains the most reliable. Active engagement, simple explanations, honest questioning, and the courage to confront confusion. These principles worked for thinkers long before the appearance of digital tools, and they will continue to work for anyone who wants to learn deeply. As we come toward the end of this reflection, consider the final idea. Understanding is a form of freedom. When you understand something, you are no longer dependent on rote memory or external authority. You can adapt, reason, and think for yourself. You become someone who can rebuild knowledge whenever needed, not someone who must constantly fetch it. People often look for secret tricks to learning, but the real secret is older than any textbook. You must make the idea your own. You must shape it in your own words, connect it to your own knowledge, and test it with your own reasoning. No one can do this work for you, but once you commit to it, learning becomes a lifelong companion rather than a temporary struggle. So here is the invitation. Take one idea you want to master, and today, using nothing more than a blank sheet of paper, try to explain it to yourself as simply as possible. If the explanation falters, do not retreat. Use that faltering as a guide. Each gap is a doorway to clarity. Understanding begins the moment memorization ends. Use this method. Try it with one idea. Let your own mind prove its power.